The US is at a crossroads, and this puts Ukraine's future at stake. One of the core foreign policy debates within the US election is around US aid to Ukraine. While President Biden has maintained support for Ukraine, increasing its potency as the war's gone on, President Trump has criticized the support. His new running mate, JD Vance, has also sounded harsh opposition towards aid to Ukraine. It's a polarizing debate with a lot of misunderstanding about what the aid is, what's being spent, and where it's actually going. But at the heart of the debate is a more fundamental question. Is the United States still a superpower? Can the United States focus on multiple conflicts simultaneously? And if not, then where should it focus its attention right now? First, I want to look at what the US has sent as of the time of this recording to Ukraine. Where does this aid come from within the US budget, and does it really impact other parts of US federal spending? And what impact has that aid had in Ukraine? Second, I want to look at the growing debate on whether the US should or should not send more aid to Ukraine, and what has Europe's contribution been, and what have they done their part? Finally, I'll hit on the core argument that I think is the real question being asked right now between Republicans and Democrats. Is the United States still a superpower? This is relevant, and I'll tell you why here in a moment. Now let's first look at US aid to Ukraine. Since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, the US has sent over $53.7 billion in security assistance. This has come through both the Presidential Drawdown Authority, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and the FMF, or Foreign Military Financing. Each of these are very important. The Presidential Drawdown Authority allows the US to quickly send military aid to allies in crisis, in this case Ukraine. It's old equipment, either heading into retirement or slated for retirement in the near future. And it's all being replaced by more modern equipment as well, which goes back to the US military. Meaning that while Ukraine gets something new and shiny and incredibly helpful in a pinch, the United States military also gets something very new and shiny. When you see a dollar value provided next to the aid coming from either the PDA or another US aid source, that's really just a valuation of that new equipment and not just the raw cash being sent. The Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, however, is a little different. USAI is direct US support that comes in the form of equipment or ammunition, but also in the form of training and advisory efforts. The US has helped train the Ukrainian military for the past couple years, specifically in infantry tactics, as well as how to use the equipment that the US is providing, like the M1 Abrams, Bradley IFV, and F-16. This is also appropriated through the FMF, which helps Ukraine fund its military, like with salaries and other various expenses. Very little of this aid is actually making it to Ukraine in the form of cash transfers, and whatever is making it to Ukraine pales in comparison to the economic shock that Ukraine has suffered from this war. In fact, the majority of dollars that are being spent here that are earmarked for Ukraine are really being spent here in the United States or within the US economy, either on brand new equipment or just the revitalization of the US defense industrial base. And this has been a key misunderstanding about US aid to Ukraine. Disinformation from Russian-linked accounts have attempted to convince Americans that money is being misused in Ukraine, and corruption in Ukraine is siphoning away US taxpayer money. Like this fake news story that President Zelensky's wife Olena bought a Bugatti in Paris, or this fake news story that Zelensky himself bought a mansion in Florida of all places, or another that he had bought 2 yachts. The goal for Russia is to increase distrust within the United States that Ukrainian aid is going to the right place, and any narrative, often paired with deepfake photos, helps toward that end. And don't we all know people on Facebook that just gobble that stuff up? This is all paired with another claim that the United States aid to Ukraine has no actual oversight, and this is a claim that I've seen from several Republicans throughout the past year and a half. It is also completely false. This stems from a case where a small Ukrainian defense company embezzled $40 million from public ammunition procurement funding. However, what's often not reported is that the Ukrainian government caught the scheme, arrested those guilty, and recovered the money. In fact, there is a whole office within the US Office of the Inspector General overseeing US aid to Ukraine. And you can check that website out as well. It has all the boring reports from the Government Accountability Office on US aid to Ukraine. Another claim is that this US aid to Ukraine is cutting into important US domestic spending priorities. That of course is not true. It's coming from already appropriated DoD funding. Now there is a bigger debate on whether the DoD funding should be what it is right now, but that is a separate debate. But we will touch on that here in just a moment. With all that said, what has US aid actually done, and has it been impactful? Well, the record has been pretty strong so far. Much of the equipment hasn't arrived in the quality that makes a huge difference, except maybe the Bradley IFV, HIMARS, and Javelin ATGMs. M1 Abrams tanks only arrived in a quantity of about 32, so not that much. Bradley IFVs, however, have arrived in the hundreds, and the record so far appears to be pretty stellar according to Ukrainian crew members who have spoken publicly about them. HIMARS have made a strategic impact on this war, forcing Russia Russia to disperse its forces in its rear areas. It's also taken out key leadership. Javelins have made a huge impact early on in blunting Russia's advance and have remained a key tool in destroying Russian equipment during their attacks. Artillery ammunition is still, of course, ramping up, with the ratio of Russian fires to Ukrainian fire falling from as high as 10-to-1 Russian shells per Ukrainian shell in early 2024 in some areas to as low as 3-to-1 in some areas. This is not only due to US aid, there are some other initiatives like the Czech initiative that are making a key to important difference in this, but the US development of new artillery production facilities that is playing a huge role here. US aid to Ukraine has been incredibly impactful, and it has greatly outpaced the aid from Europe. And this takes us to a key element about the debate around US aid. We've already done some myth busting, so I'm not going to jump back over whether this aid is being properly handled or not. I think we've already discussed that and how a lot of that comes from disinformation. What I'm more interested in is what I think is a more interesting conversation. I think you'll find that more interesting too. And it's one that I actually think has a little bit of merit at least. And I'm saying this as a pro-Ukrainian American that wants to see aid continue. The main contention from Republicans that I found interesting stems from the question, why isn't Europe doing more? After all, doesn't the war in Ukraine impact European security more than it impacts the United States? The easy answer is yes, it does impact them more than it impacts the United States. The uncomfortable truth ties into a criticism of NATO that President Trump has long held. That is that many NATO members aren't doing their fair share in security and paying their fair dues. And this is not just about NATO defense spending, at least not anymore. That was before the war in Ukraine kicked off, but now it's much more immediate and the need is much more acute. Still, as of the time of this recording, 12 of the 32 NATO members still are not hitting their 2% pledge of GDP defense spending that they had pledged to do. And this is actually down from 2023, which was still as the war in Ukraine was going on, which saw 22 NATO members not hitting their defense spending pledge. Now, there is a good reason why this might be lagging and why these countries might be taking a while to kick up their defense spending. And for that, I'm going to turn this over to Preston Stewart for a moment.
During his first term, he talked a lot about NATO freeloading and European countries too reliant on the U.S. For security. A byproduct of that was a lot of European states picked up their defense spending, and that has benefited Ukraine because they've been able to have the inventories to tap into to send munitions to Ukraine. Generally speaking, European defense spending is still on the increase. It hasn't peaked. In terms of the time delay to get more funding, I would take in consideration there that it takes a little bit of time for governments to increase their spending. So yes, I think the initial invasion or the full-scale invasion in 2022 prompted a lot of governments to increase defense spending. It was going to take a period of time. You know, the next legislative session, the next parliament, whatever it might be, to actually ramp up to that 2% or greater. So I think it was directly in response to that. We got to give them a little leeway for they couldn't write the check next day.
In my mind, the argument from Republicans is kind of like whenever you're playing a sport and you're just not into it and your coach looks at you disappointed and says, I cannot care about this more than you can care about this. And so the talk from the Republicans has been whether or not the US should just cut aid to Ukraine to really kind of coerce or force Europe back into action to pick up the slack. And some of this comes from concerns that I think are also rooted in some Russian disinformation campaigns, like what NATO is and what Europe really is and is not doing about this. The main part, though, about Republican criticism of Ukrainian aid is not necessarily, at least in my mind, about Ukraine and more about Europe and Europe's priorities. Basically, them saying that the US cannot care about European security more than the Europeans. And so that takes them to a more coercive and transactional strategy. We've seen the defense spending pledge met by more and more NATO members in 2024 as the prospect of another Trump presidency looms. This may be an indication that the level of coercion is actually working within Europe. It's still not perfect. Even with all this happening, Germany is set to have its aid to Ukraine in 2025. The belief in Berlin is that Ukraine has already received enough funding for the near term, and so Germany can cut back its funding for Ukraine and put that money towards other areas. And of course, my mind takes me to just another sports analogy. This is like catching a football for a touchdown, but as you're running into the end zone, you spike the ball on the 1-yard line thinking that you got a touchdown, but it's really just a turnover. You didn't score anything and you actually just helped the other team. And I'm looking at you, Deshaun Jackson. Yes, this all benefits Russia in the short term. Less aid to Ukraine benefits Russia in the short term, but if it does spur Europe into action and it forces them to revitalize their defense industrial base, remilitarize and focus on Russia as an actual threat, that does not help Russia in the medium to long term at all. And so while Ukraine might endure some hard times for the next year and a half, if they're able to hold out, then Europe Europe's going to be in a much better position militarily, not only to support Ukraine, but also themselves to be able to counter Russia on the European continent. At least that appears to be the hope from the Republican Party when they're talking about this issue. Why it matters that Republicans are so vocal about European security is mainly because, ironically, they followed Obama's lead and seemingly pivoted to Asia. China is the big villain now, and it's not a made-up concern. There are real security challenges that the US and allies face in the Pacific. The US has been behind the 8 ball and doesn't have an alliance network as robust as NATO to help counter China. Therefore, they argue that the US needs to shift its focus from Europe, where NATO could, at least theoretically, and it should in practice, pick up the slack and instead focus on areas like Taiwan, North Korea, and Iran, where multiple wars are either already going on or where they loom. Another key concern from Republicans is really just a general shift from foreign policy to focusing on domestic policy. Again, the aid to Ukraine is coming from the DoD budget. And so for the Republicans to make good on this promise and peeling back aid to Ukraine, they'll really have to peel back on the DoD budget. And very few people have actually succeeded in doing that. And whenever you see the prospect of multiple wars looming, multiple wars already going on, there is a good question on whether or not now is the time to start peeling back on DoD funding. Still though, more Americans are concerned with matters at home than abroad, and they may be more eager to vote in a candidate or candidates who run on domestic reforms at the cost of foreign policy. While the Republicans are more focused on forcing Europe to act and domestic policy, the Democrats focus on the precedent that this could set in the future with other areas of the world. If an authoritarian power can invade its democratic neighbor and the United States will at some point grow tired of the war and give up supporting the democratic neighbor, then what kind of precedent does that set for other areas of the world like Taiwan? Therefore, the US has to stand by Ukraine and establish deterrence against China in this conflict. And as a reminder, deterrence is not about tough talk. It's about actually showing that you're willing to follow up on whatever you say you're going to do, and you have a track record of doing so. So from the Democrats' perspective, now is the time to follow through and show China that we really do mean business and we're not going anywhere. And this takes us to what I think might be the more interesting debate in this whole discussion. Is the United States still a superpower? Can the United States focus on multiple conflicts simultaneously? If the answer is yes, then the US should be able to do both at the same time. Supporting Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel and other wars at the same time should certainly be possible. While the US defense industrial base has atrophied heavily since the end of the Cold War, it's coming back to life now, and US artillery ammunition production is just one example of that. However, if the answer is no, then the US has to pick and choose where it sends its support and where it chooses to sit things out. Republicans seem to be arguing that the US is no longer a superpower and that it has to pick and choose its battles. Democrats, on the other hand, believe that the US is still a superpower. There is a part of this, though, where the incumbent party may have access to information and data that the other party that's not empowered may not. For instance, President Biden, is receiving daily president update briefs, which give him all kinds of just information about what's going on in the world, what's going on here in the United States. That's not something that President Trump is receiving right now. So there's a chance that President Trump might, get elected, start receiving those updates, and then he might change his tune because he realizes, okay, there's some data that I wasn't considering before. Things look a bit nicer than they did, or maybe they don't look good, and the course of action that I was originally proposing during the election may not be feasible or wise at this moment.
I don't think we have a clear indication of what Trump would do should he be elected. Abandoning Ukraine, cutting things off entirely would be a major geopolitical move with a lot of pushback from a lot of our allies around the world, not just in Europe, but around the world. To your point earlier, there's a lot of folks arguing about what signal this might send to other allies, Taiwan, for instance. So I think like a hard stop really isn't in the cards. A hard stop doesn't really benefit anybody, to include Trump, outside of like a very narrow political group. So I wouldn't really expect that.
And of course, this is a debate that not only Russia and China are keen to influence, but other countries like Ukraine and Europe are keen to influence in this debate here in the United States. If we have an open information environment, so they can influence kind of how this conversation goes. So no, we're not going to have a nice, clean, and kind debate about this here in the United States, because it's not just us Americans talking about it. We have other voices that are in this room with us talking about it, trying to sway our opinion for one end or another. And so that's going to increase the level of rhetoric, whether it makes us more distrusting of each other, whether it makes things more antagonistic, or whether it tries to sway Americans towards supporting Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine, or, pivoting and supporting another country. That's just how it's going to go. And so we need to keep our minds aware of that. And it's just going to make the whole debate more toxic. And so all of that is on the ballot this election cycle. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about America's status as a global superpower, about the act of deterrence, and whether or not we continue to support Ukraine and establish deterrence in other parts of the world in order to prevent future conflicts. It's about European security and whether Europe is doing enough, and whether the United States allows Europe to continue to get a quote-unquote free ride in security thanks to U.S. taxpayer money and U.S. service member sacrifice. It's about whether or not America actually finishes the play, or it just he did it again. Shout out to my friend Preston Stewart for sharing his time and his brain power with this video. I really appreciate it. You can check the full video out on my other channel. That'll be linked at the end of this one. But check out his channel and check out his Substack. He's got all kinds of really great articles on his Substack talking about this kind of stuff, and he talks about this stuff daily on his YouTube channel. So I've got both of those linked down in the video description. Definitely go give him a follow and a subscribe to show him some support. And he's got great content that I think you'd really enjoy. I want to hear your thoughts on this, so comment your thoughts down below. Let's continue this conversation. You know, where do you stand on the U.S. as a superpower, European security, this whole debate that we've just discussed? And leave a like if you found this video interesting and to help it reach new audiences. That'll really help this conversation get more enriched with more voices. And of course, subscribe for more content just like this. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.